Eric. Thank you so much to all of you for coming. I want to extend a special thanks to Megan and Ezra and Maria from the CREES team for logistical and technical support, and also to the history department for helping to advertise this event. So I think we're going to have a good discussion today. And actually, where Eric said that I'll be explaining what this image is, I thought that we'd start off, asking y'all what this image is. So I'll explain what my talk's going to be about and why we're all here. But why don't we start out just kind of voicing a little bit, if you came into this room having no idea anything about Russia even, or Russian history, or the current war in Ukraine, or even necessarily image analysis, what kind of vibe do you get from this photo? What's going on in this photo? Or if you do have that area knowledge, more specifically, what is happening in this photo? Just feel free to shout out.
Looking to the future.
Looking to the future. Yes, most of them, for sure. What else?
Typical
or looking
family.
to the past, depending on how you see it.
Yeah, we could switch that around. Megan, were you gonna say something?
I was just going to say the stereotypical family having, 2.5 kids or whatever it is, good heteronormative family.
Very heteronormative. 2.5 indeed. I actually didn't think about that before, but the way the head's you kind of, you interpret that as a little bit of a .5 at the end there. Anything else that strikes you?
It's a man which never could be mobilized in Russia or in Ukraine because his family has 3 children.
Very relevant to what we're going to talk about. Thank you.
It does seem pronatalist.
It sure does, doesn't it? Pronatalist for who?
Blonde Slavs?
Blonde Slavs, yes, indeed. Okay, great observation. Thank you. I think that will start there. So I titled my talk today, We Are an Empire, History and Culture in Wartime Russia, because the Russian state, the Soviet Union before it, and the Russian Empire officially is thus titled before that, has a very long legacy of combining history and culture and instrumentalizing this in a way to carry out particular policy goals. And so as much as we could talk about the entire history of that phenomenon, we're going to mostly focus on post-Soviet Russia with a little bit of history back in there to contextualize things a little bit. But why did I pick this quote, "We are an empire"? Who said this? It wasn't these people. So there's an individual named Vladimir Putin, who you may have heard about in the news. I'll talk about who he is exactly shortly, but I wanted to share this quote from him from one of his recent books that he just wrote on Peter the Great. So he's talking about, his impression of what Peter the Great would say if he could see Russia today. I'll just read this entire quote. Peter could have seen our country today. What would he want to fix? He would have given us a walloping for many reasons. For our wastefulness of our lands after 1917 and after 1991. For the banditry of the 90s. For our craving for comfort, for laziness, for our loss of energy. He would tighten the screws. He would step on the gas, raise all the sails, and an icy wind would once again hit us in the face. And we would remember what we've forgotten, that we are an empire, capital E, and that an empire of the courageous has neither limits, nor shores, nor borders, only horizons. So this was posted on his Telegram channel announcing his book release on May 7th of this past year. And in case you weren't positive what he was talking about, he specified that we're talking about, quote, the spirit of the times, the spirit of today, the spirit of capital E empire. And again, if you weren't certain what he was talking about, everything that I think about today is in this book. Stepping back for a moment, who exactly was Peter the Great? Peter the Great was the first emperor of Russia when it was called the Russian Empire as such. So he named the Russian state that existed when he was born. He changed the name to the Russian Empire in 1721. He was a extraordinarily imposing figure. He expanded the geographical boundaries of the Russian, what he then later, eventually named the Russian Empire, extensively. Well, the map, I'll bring up with that later in this talk. He was, well, actually, I'll quiz you guys if you know about this. So, but he's an extraordinarily sort of unmistakable figure in Russia's cultural history today as this expansionist leader, and a very sort of intimidating one at that. So Peter the Great's name has been in the news a bit since the war against Ukraine began with the full-scale invasion in 2022, but also before that. Not least because Vladimir Putin, president of Russia today, has compared himself directly to Peter the Great as this individual who wants to take back Russian lands. As Putin put it, we can talk about why exactly he worded it like that. But a lot of analysts and commentators have made the same comparison, that Putin sees himself as this modern-day Peter the Great, that he's kind of trying to manifest this, imperial reality, transposing Peter the Great's approach to expanding Russian geographical space, and it kind of explaining the war in Ukraine partially in those terms. So this is a pretty common appellation, I guess you could say, that people are assigning all in the policy world, in the academic community, and in the press. And it's one of two kind of main narratives, historical figures that analysts have been comparing Vladimir Putin to. The other one, of course, is that there's this claim that Putin is trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. There's a variety of different takes on that. These, for some reason, kind of tend to be more from Western politicians. You can see Mitt Romney has something to say about this. President Trump something very different to say about it. And this is likely because simply of their kind of lived experience with the Soviet Union, right, as opposed to the deeper kind of cultural, historical knowledge of Peter the Great that academics and people in policy don't have. So there's these kind of two takes. Now these takes are very different, actually. So for those of you in the crowd who know anything about Peter the Great, what was his kind of world orientation for where he wanted the Russian Empire to go?
West?
Or
to the west.
The West, yes, the window to the West. That's what his entire program was kind of known as, was opening this window to the West. And then there's, so that's kind of, one conception of engaging with the world. Expanding to the West, engaging the West, introducing Western norms, ways of governance, and so on, and kind of just being part of this international community. Then there's the Soviet Union, which I don't want to necessarily talk about what their engagement with the world is, but thinking a little bit about, on a domestic level, what it would mean to say that Putin was trying to rebuild the Soviet Union. So critical to this is thinking about, for those of you who know, and for those of you who don't, you will find out shortly we talk about this, how the Soviet Union treated the multi-ethnic population that it had within its borders. So, I don't know if I see any of my students from last semester here, but can anyone say, in a word, what did the Soviet Union attempt to do with all these different nationalities in terms of, I'm sorry?
Russify them.
Russify them? Sometimes, yes. What else?
Unified?
Unify them, yes. It's a little more complicated, so. Do I see another?
They're nationalizing their
Culturate?
Culturate, internationalize.
Nationalize.
Nationalize. So what's the phrase? National informed socialist in content. So the Soviet Union had all of these different republics, and then even within the republics it held these different smaller geographical formations. But there was never an attempt to kind of say explicitly the Soviet Union is going to become Russian. The Soviet Union wanted everybody to be Soviet, and there was this undercurrent and very complicated conversation about, Russification, rightly as you pointed out, and how they wanted to be Russian, wanted people to sort of, latently be Russian, you could say. But there was a preservation of all these different ethnic republics, and that was key to the Soviet experiment, was maintaining this sort of national geographical distinction. So that's important when we think about what Vladimir Putin is doing today to keep in mind. Is that really what he's trying to do, is kind of preserve a explicitly multi-ethnic empire? Is he trying to do that? We're going to find out after I talk about what I'm going to talk about. So there's these questions that people are asking, basically the reason that this is part of this national conversation and why all these statements in the press, because people are trying to figure out what is Putin's end game with the war in Ukraine, and just more generally in his engagement with the world. What is he trying to do? Is he trying to be Peter the Great? Is he trying to be the Soviet Union? So I would pose another question that's like perhaps glib but a little simpler, and I think gives us some analytical clarity. What has he actually done so far, and what can we learn from that? So that brings me to my kind of methodological framing here. Was this really ugly, huge quote from the introduction to a book that I have a chapter in that just came out over the summer. Basically, what we're arguing here, and what I'm going to kind of use today to try to say something relevant and insightful about these questions that I've just put on the board about what he's doing, what we kind of glean from that, is that we're arguing in this book that there's a utility of film and formal cinematic analysis in assessing a nation's informational space. So when you think of open source information, which if you're following the war in Ukraine, you've probably heard of, we typically think of satellite data and maps that show troop movements, that show exploited arms depots, and just publicly available data, telegram channels from journalists and analysts who are putting all this information out there. Sort of anything that you don't have to have classified access to, is known as open source information. And so we're basically arguing that cultural production, specifically here in the form of film, but I argue more broadly, music, the arts, theater, television, variety of things that constitute culture, as broadly as you can imagine it. All of this is useful to look at as open source intelligence, specifically to get past what the author of our introduction, who is not me, calls, I think, really usefully the shroud of unpredictability that Vladimir Putin's government tries to use and to hide behind to conceal their strategic acumen. So that's kind of our premise, and the premise that I'm also using here today, is that we can get information from this cultural production that might just look on the face of it like this is just a movie that was put out, to make money or to make people have something to do on the weekend. Because of the way that I'll talk about Russian cultural policy is organized and set up, there's a lot more that we can learn from that production. So, a little outline of where we're going to go today. Very briefly, I'll talk about what is Russian cultural policy. We don't really have cultural policy in America, so that may not make sense as a concept. What were its goals historically and what are they now? What does the Russian state mean by unity? And that's a spoiler alert, that's what the goal is. And why is this such a major current goal? How is the Russian state using culture to promote unity, whatever they mean by that? And how do these efforts help us to understand regime intentions going forward, which obviously is the goal, one of the goals here. And then also the very important question of why this is important. So there's a number of different takeaways that we can get from this kind of analysis. But I'm hoping specifically here today to look at this sort of insight into the Russian state's long-term objectives, which I think you can kind of logically imagine may be easier to enact in the form of fictional, cultural production than it's possible to manifest them in real life through military action, for example, or through state policy. Hoping to better understand the informational environment in which both the Russian government and Russian citizens currently exist, and sort of insight into how they view their own reality and the reality around and outside of them. And also hoping to gain insight into the prospects for a peace settlement, quote unquote, between Russia and Ukraine, which is really the big question, that we're dealing with right now. There was news today, and I didn't even get a chance to look at what this article said, but there was some headline about Vladimir Putin putting out, quote unquote, new rules for nuclear engagement. So this is a big question that's on everybody's minds, and I think nobody has a satisfying answer to. So perhaps we can gain some insight towards that question. Certainly not answering definitively, but something. So, what is Russian cultural policy? Who are these people? This is the Ministry of Culture. On the right here, this guy in the upper left is this individual who I mentioned at the beginning, who wrote this book on Peter the Great, named Vladimir Putin. So just a little bit about him, because we're going to kind of spend some time with him today, and he's an interesting figure. He was the Minister of Culture in Russia from 2012 to 2020, at which point he then graduated to aide to President Putin personally, which some people saw as a downgrade at the time, but it was definitely an upgrade, as we'll talk about. He kind of came into the Ministry of Culture at a time when Russia's cultural sphere had kind of taken ideology out of the question of what we're going to do with culture in this country. So there was a lot more freer expression back before 2012 than there was after Medinsky came in, because Medinsky's kind of main shtick was that he was unhappy with the state of Russia and its place on the global stage. He was a writer, he is a writer, obviously. He has 2 PhDs, which there's documented evidence that he plagiarized both of. One in history and I think the other one is political science. And he became famous before becoming minister for writing a series of books called Myths About Russia, which basically tried to argue that there are all of these things that people, globally and within Russia believe about Russia that aren't true, and I need to go out there and defend Russia against the slander. So the idea that Russians are pissed backwards, as it's put, and that the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact was a bad thing, which he argues against, and that's too long of a story to tell here today, unfortunately. So basically, he sees Russia's kind of ideological potential in its history of military glory. When he graduated to presidential aide, the woman below him, Olga Lyubimova, took over as minister, but she's pretty much faded into the background, and Medinsky has taken up quite a broad series of responsibilities, which notably, as we'll discuss shortly, include authoring a new series of public school history textbooks that were introduced last fall. He also became well known for being the person appointed the head of Russia's quote-unquote peace delegation to speak with Ukrainians in March 2022. When I heard on the news that this is who they had picked, that Putin had picked to head this delegation, it was like midnight, and I almost fell over, because there couldn't be a clearer sign from kind of his writing about how he sees Ukraine as, basically not its own country, that this was a bad faith effort on the part of the Russians, but that wouldn't have been obvious on the face of it already. So that's what he's, and that this effort did not last very long, and obviously nothing came of it. And there's been some interesting reporting about that recently, if anybody wants to learn about that further. But, so for our purposes, back to, a little more context for cultural policy in this country. So, like I said, there's this entire huge history of Russian cultural policy that goes back to the imperial era. Just to kind of stick a little bit with some context from the Soviet era, which is what I work on specifically, there's this kind of 2 stories that are out there about cultural policy. One has to do with a phenomenon that you've probably heard of, socialist realism. That's, you see in propaganda, these kind of messages about how great the Soviet state already is, and how, it's basically your job to manifest what's already in this poster. And then later on, Khrushchev's thaw, where there was this liberalization in cultural relations, things like Alexander Solzhenitsyn's One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich is published. And on the left here, we have that kind of basic story. On the left, the very left of the leftist photo is Ekaterina Fortseva, who was the longest standing Soviet Minister of Culture from 1961 to 1974. And Ernst Nezvesti and Yevgeny Yushchenko on her right, kind of just enjoying themselves in this party as she, clearly doesn't want to be there. She doesn't really, care about culture at all. So this kind of like story of, these elite bureaucrats and these very famous writers and how the thaw impacted them and gave them this, increased freedom. But of course, it's a more complicated story than that. But basically, it's a history that's about these type of, literati that were known across the nation and even on the global stage. A lot of Soviet cultural policy history is written about people like that. And there's a lot less about people like these people on the right. So this is a brigade, an agitational brigade, that if you go down kind of the hierarchy of the Ministry of Culture's departments, you would get way down to the local level. And you'd have this guy with this guitar, whose job is to go out, to the Buryat steppe and find some farmers who are struggling to meet their quota for corn and just entertain them until they can do that better. So you can see this kind of guy on the right who's not super thrilled with this situation, but this is kind of the very low local level experience of what Soviet cultural policy looked like in reality for the majority of people, were these kind of little initiatives where the state tries to say, okay, we have a cultural ministry, what can we do with it to actualize our policy goals? Great. So, some people who know me know that I can't go like 5 steps without talking about this current situation. But there is this huge emphasis that I have an entire dissertation chapter about how the entire apparatus of the Soviet Ministry of Culture, after Stalin dies, and kind of let up a lot of control over it, was like hugely oriented towards how do we boost agricultural production. So there's all this corn propaganda, etc. And like I said, these kind of attempts to increase the harvest and participate in this broader effort to both feed people, but then also, prove on the global stage that the Soviet Union can grow enough food for its own people, which was not, given at that point. So, two kind of different stories. This very kind of ideological story and a very kind of utilitarian story. Both of these stories are true, and both of them are relevant to the situation that we have today. So, what does Russian cultural policy look like now? There's a lot of documents about this. And I'll just give you kind of a little feel for what they say. There's cultural policy, and then there's also a law on culture. They've been actually trying to rewrite the law on culture since 2009 and have not succeeded in finishing that yet, but they're trying. So, but you'll kind of get the idea of what they have in mind from these quotes. So, 2014 project concept. The goal of state cultural policy is the spiritual, cultural, and national self-determination of Russia, the unification of Russian society, and the formation of moral, independent-minded, creative, patriotic individuals by harnessing all of the potential of our national culture. Now, if we don't do that, we have a huge problem on our hands. We could face a humanitarian crisis, which includes the following possibilities for Russia's future: the deformation of historical memory, a negative valuation of significant parts of national history, thinking that our history was bad. This could happen if we don't manifest cultural policy in the right way. The proliferation of the false conception of Russia as historically being backwards, the atomization of society, a rupture in social connections among friends, family, and neighbors, and an increase in individualism and the disregard for the rights of others. So this is what they're worried about if we don't get cultural policy right. So what are some goals? I'm not going to read all these, but you can get the idea. We hope, says the Russian state, that cultural policy can form a harmoniously developed individual that shares traditional Russian spiritual and moral values. start thinking about that photo that we started out with. You can kind of glean some particular spiritual moral value from that. Strengthen the unity and cohesion of Russian society by prioritizing its cultural and humanitarian development, civic identity, a united cultural sphere, multinational and multi-religious peace and harmony, preserve historical and cultural heritage, pass down the values, norms, traditions, and customs, and types of behavior that are traditional for Russian civilization from one generation to the next. And of course, guarantee the Russian Federation's cultural sovereignty, etc. So these are pretty lofty goals, right? Does this sound like something that you could actualize through state policy? We'll see. We'll see what they try to do. So why is there this focus on unity? I'm going to go through this really fast. I mentioned how Peter the Great greatly expanded the boundaries of the Russian Empire. You can kind of see here, Peter the Great actually isn't, he's not out, sort of outlined specifically in one of these colors, but you can kind of see over time how the Russian state conceptualizes its own expansion. These maps are actually pretty bad. All that they kind of mean is this is what the Russian state has laid claim to. In reality, especially in Central Asia, which if you're not familiar is down here, I'll show that pointer, and Siberia, out here, and the Far East. You could lay claim, as a state in the 17th century to all this land and have no actual practical control over it. And that was largely the case until the late 19th century for a lot of this territory, which will be important as I continue here. So there's this concern, though, as you can imagine, and as you may know, of how do we keep this huge empire together? And then even, since we're fast forwarding here to the collapse of the Soviet Union, even just Russia itself, as currently constituted, how do we keep that from getting even smaller? This is a huge concern for the Russian state for its entire history. And it's right to be concerned to a certain extent from its own point of view of wanting to maintain territorial integrity because of separatist movements that have had a huge impact on Russia's conception of itself, of its military in the post-Soviet states. That's especially the case with the Chechen Wars, that a lot of blood was spilled over and resulted in this kind of different status that Chechnya has now, although it's completely under control of the Russian Federation. But these movements exist, right, and have existed. In 2004, Russian state established what they called Unity Day. It was based in like a 17th century, I think, I forget what exactly, independence from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, maybe, something like that. Anyway, nobody knows why it exists, but it was just this day that they kind of made up, to promote multinational, within Russia, multi-ethnic unity. And it immediately became this horrible kind of day that ultranationalists would gather and kind of exact their general rage about, xenophobia towards minorities and foreigners writ large. And the Russian government eventually pulled back from making Unity Day a big thing. So, okay, we we're not really sure what to do internally to deal with our separatism, how to keep people together. But what brings people together more than anything else is having a common enemy some other place, right? So there's been this rise over the years of this conception of national unity, not only based on this traditional moral, spiritual, and social values thing we've been talking about, but also rejecting the West and its ideology. And so there have been a number of laws, especially that were passed in 2012, to ban, what's called homosexual propaganda. Basically, you can get arrested for holding hands in public. Acts that, quote, offend the sentiments of religious believers, meaning, basically code for Orthodox individuals, Russian Orthodox religion, and this idea of these foreign agents, people from the West who are hiding in our society, these kind of saboteurs, the George Soros conspiracy theory, funding, and trying to influence Russians to be more like the West, which, as you'll remember, is very unlikely to be great, right? So there's all this legislation, and then after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, there was this huge additional packet of legislation that strengthened the fines and punishments for separatism. Because it's one thing for Crimea to separate from Ukraine, but it's another thing, right, for the parts of the Russian Federation that might want to leave, think about doing that. The indigenous UDK activist on the right here, he now lives in, I think, Vermont. He was heavily persecuted, but all these sort of little, not even separatist movements, but just national organizations, dedicated to understanding the history and traditions and celebrations of one's own ethnicity. All of these were targeted by the Russian state as potentially hostile forces. And on the left here, we have these kind of little green men who were later turned out to be Prigozhin's Wagner group, as you may have heard of. And if you saw the poster for this event, which I did not put that poster with the family on, that image with the family on that poster, that's what that little green guy was representing. It was these special forces that went into Crimea kind of without the Russian flag on their uniforms, and basically affected the takeover of that peninsula. So continuing that tradition, in the summer of 2021, Vladimir Putin wrote this essay, or at least he posted with his name on it, this essay that you've probably heard of, about, basically, long story short, I'm sure you've heard of this, saying that Russia and Ukraine and Belarus are really the same country. That's really the gist of it, for our purpose here. So what's notable about this entire kind of attitude towards how we see the Russian state treating different nationalities and ethnicities, and their kind of framework that that essay and that a lot of this kind of legislation and cultural policy tries to act to bring about this desired unity, is that it goes back a very long time. So Randall Wakefield here, back in 1999, pointed out, posted very succinctly, as opposed to the elites of other imperializing nations whose explicit or implicit assumption of cultural superiority caused them to view their own values as universal and something to be imposed onto others, members of the Russian cultural elite proposed a model that emphasized their nation's particular sponge-like ability to absorb the best that other peoples had to offer as the basis for a universal, inclusive national culture. So this kind of taking in of other nations and saying that they're Russian and that separatism is going to be punished, right? The basis for this national image lay in a novel interpretation of the Imperial project as a project of the translation of world culture into and through Russia. So this role of culture is kind of playing this role. So, going, very currently down this road to what we're seeing cultural policy do, I did want to touch this on these textbooks because there's this, nexus between history and culture broadly, but also very specifically with Mr. Medinsky. This is the textbook that he wrote, and he frames, the war in Ukraine as something that actually unifies Russian society. And it's kind of impossible to understand that formulation unless you understand kind of these predecessors to where this ideology came from and kind of what this unity means, right? So specifically it says, the special military operation, as they call it, brought together a society, people from different ages and professions. People lend support by collecting donations and giving presents to soldiers, humanitarian help to people who lived in these affected regions, a real cult of bravery for the fighters in the war. So the idea of this kind of, righteous battle that has brought us together. Not that splitting us apart, but it actually brought us together. And the rest of these documents, there's a couple of pages of the textbook that, just to show kind of how much of a military recruitment document this is, more than a textbook to teach history. There's all these biographies of young Russian people who volunteered to take part in the war, one way or another. People volunteer, let's not forget the women. So this is aimed at 11th graders and what they're reading now in schools, public schools across the Russian Federation. So, to go back a little bit, just again for some additional context, there's this history, and kind of set up what we're talking about next. There's this history in Russia and the Soviet Union of celebrating what they call, the voluntary joining states. So in 1954 on the left, there was a celebration of the reunification of Ukraine and Russia. And then, 50 years later, we had the voluntary entrance of Buryatia, which is a Siberian republic, into the Russian state. And these extraordinarily complicated imperial processes are framed as, these gracious incidents of people coming together. So, how is the Russian state trying to explain to people and frame these phenomena and kind of how Russian state building has manifested? How are they trying to frame this today? What does state building look like in Russia today? What are we doing? What's happening? What are we doing? Actually, I just listened to this. So this movie, Pinfield's 28 Men, came out in 2015, and as you can kind of glean from this, it's a World War II movie about a completely not true, mythicized episode of these 28 soldiers in the Soviet Red Army who fought off a battalion of German tanks, basically with no equipment by hand. According to the myth, they basically halted this advance on Moscow and are heroes of the Soviet Union. It's a long story about the fact that it's made up and that there's a movie about it, and a movie that actually won a state award called for fidelity to historical truth. But anyway, for our purposes here, there's actually kind of more interesting phenomenon that I want to put my finger on. The Panfilov battalion, I'm probably not using the right military terminology, but this group were based in Kazakhstan. And they were extraordinarily multi-ethnic. There were like 6 different nationalities of the soldiers in this group. And the movie gives each one a name that corresponds with the supposed soldier that died in the it's the mythicized episode of this battle. So, this particular pair here, this particular pair, we can see on the screen is portrayed, we have an ethnically Kazakh individual on the right and a Slavic-looking individual on the left. And so it's a sniper, and we see his kind of pair, sniper sword is paired up. And they have this exchange that I want to read. It's very brief. But basically, the Slavic-looking image on the left says, the Germans probably think that they've got it all worked out, that they know our weak spot and can go towards the highway. And that's good. Let them try. Let's show them, if they don't know it, who we Russians are and what sort of weak spot we have, right? And the person on the right says, we'll show them, but I'm Kazakh. On the left, aren't Kazakhs Russian? Give me a break. It's Russia we're both fighting for. On the right, I'm just kidding. On the left, kidding. When we fight for Kazakhstan, we'll show them who the Kazakhs are. You can bet on it. And on the right, this guy says, deal. I would show you just clips of this, but it's on Amazon Prime and you have to watch ads and it's like a huge pain. So, so bear with me, with that. But, so there's this kind of, really explicit sublimation of what Kazakhstan is. So, in real life, the person on the left, the name, who's the named individual offended this actor, is from Kyrgyzstan. So there is no way that this dialogue could have possibly happened, because as much as it's possible that a Russian soldier in the Red Army might kind of just sublimate his Kazakh counterpart into, we're all basically Russian, this is a very Russified moment of our history. Being from Kyrgyzstan, he would never plausibly say we're fighting for Russia and that we're not fighting for Kazakhstan, because these, of course, are one country. The Soviet commemoration of this incident, as you can see in the symbolism up on the top here of the 6 different nationalities that made up the Panfilovs group, is very explicitly celebrated. This bottom memorial is the one that's in Kazakhstan itself. So what does this kind of sublimation, what is this conception of unity, how we conceptualize unity, what does this mean for Kazakhstan, which is a sovereign state? Just over a month before the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, this Russian State Duma deputy gave an interview in which he made it very clear that he saw the Kazakh government's Latinization of their alphabet, moving away from Cyrillic, and other general policies associated with language in particular as the exact same thing that the Ukrainians were doing. So they're going the exact same direction, just at different speeds and in different ways. So a lot of people from Kazakhstan are concerned about this type of rhetoric, which is extraordinarily widespread, and which we see, in the preceding clip, is just this very casual statement that, of course, Kazakhs are Russian. Maybe you have your own sovereign state, but you're Russian. We're speaking Russian. We're defending Russian. That movie was made in 2015. It seems that the Russian Ministry of Defense is not quite satisfied with the amount or quality of military production that's kind of getting their point across. And so they created, in June 2022, their own film production studio. And so you can imagine the kind of number and production scale of these movies is set to increase pretty dramatically, and already has. The kind of justification for it, as discussed in this interview, is basically that, there's this question down here that the interviewer asked, why did you make this Vankino film studio? And he doesn't answer. The guy just says, well, we agreed to it with the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. And just kind of like leaves it at that. So, okay, this is the last example I think I have time to talk about. There is a website for this production company called Vankino. Their domain is actually down right now. I tried yesterday. It seems like they haven't paid their domain fee, so if you try to look at this yourself, you can do that right now. Luckily, I got the screenshot before that happened. But there's this movie that they have created, this short 27-minute film, that they're making into a longer feature film that's currently in production. It's called Kongure, and they describe it as a movie about a historical episode that preceded the Dzungar Khane's inclusion as part of Russia. So again, we see this language of, he became included. It's extraordinarily exclusive of language of, conquering any, hint of military conflict, although they show that that's pretty much most of what the movie consists of. Diplomatic relations. It's just this inclusion that kind of, we're supposed to, kind of see the gentle process by which this happens. And TASS reported that, the idea behind this movie was to, again, preserve the traditions of the people of Siberia. So you might be wondering, what is the Dzungar Khanate? What is Kongure? most people don't know. Where do I have that? Okay, we're gonna get to that. I'll try to wrap this up quick. But this is, this stuff is. I wish I could show you this movie, but there's no subtitles. But it's crazy. One of the first screens is a statement saying all the characters in this story are made up, but all of the coincidences are non-coincidental, for there are no accidents in history. So that you can kind of already get the idea where this is going to go. So the action takes place specifically, they say at the head of the Yenisei River, which is very specifically Kizil, the capital Tuva. I have Tuva kind of outlined here in red a little bit to give you guys the scale. And note here the scale of Tuva compared to Mongolia. Kazakhstan for some reason isn't labeled there, but Kazakhstan is a big one, etc. It's a pretty small territory. The film opens up. There's this, who's noted in the liner notes or whatever. She's labeled girl personifying the spirit of the cry. She's here in traditional Tuvan dress. She frees this Russian person. His name is Semyon Petrovsin from his Zangar captors. We don't have time to talk about that guy. And they try to escape from this, the face that we're given here of the Zangar Khanate. So the Zangar Khanate it's a nomadic steppe. It was a nomadic steppe empire, and Tuva, Tuva is not even like part of this map at this point in the mid-18th century. Most of the Zangar Khanate is Xinjiang today, and then these other Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Mongolia. But that kind of difference is, again, completely sublimated by this film, in which Tuva, modern-day Russian Republic, is the kind of notable national group. But then what is this word Kongure? Our Russian man escapes, and there's a Tuvan hunter who accompanies him on his journey back to the Russian Tsar. And the hunter here says Kongure. And then the Russian asks, what is Kongure? Tuvan says, it's the motherland. I am Kongure. All are Kongure. All the clans have scattered, but no matter. They'll come together soon. So what might the Russian respond to this in our current cultural historical context? Any guess? Just a quick guess. Want some help? Some help would be good, but don't interfere? Got it. Okay, so the rest of the movie kind of proceeds. This woman, the spirit of the cry, shows up with horses to help them on their journey. There are these kind of ninja-looking people that are the warriors of the Zangar Khanate who try to kill them, and they basically battle them until this girl shows up again with a raft, and they escape happily. And it turns out that the girl personifying the spirit of the cry traditionally shows up to help the course of history, which of course is a thing that happens. So this is a movie that this was funded by this, right again, this Ministry of Defense film studio, and they have all this program that goes along with this. So just to kind of give you a sense of how these films are put out and then how people engage with them, the Ministry of Culture has all these different little institutions right across the country, and they organize, programming like, let's bring this direction to a school, let's make sure that people see it and that school children talk about it. So it's a very long reach that this ministry has to kind of get these ideas out there in this media form. We don't have time to talk about any of this. All right, there's this whole other thing that happened yesterday that we don't have time to talk about either. I wish I could, and I'll show you guys, I'll explain that in the Q&A if you want, which we have like 5 minutes for, but so, excluding the last point, which I didn't get a chance to talk about at all, but what can we come away from all of this, this cultural narrative creation surrounding history? We can say pretty surely that there's a significant amount of Russian state investment in promoting a conception of national belonging that is based in language and this kind of vague conception of culture that is Russian, but then is able to sponge in these other nationalities, and that supersedes national borders and ethnic difference. And we can also say that there is a significant investment in creating this informational environment in which well-established historical narratives from Peter the Great, which by the way, the Congolese thing takes place during the reign of Peter the Great, I've already mentioned, to the Soviet Union, like in Phil's 28 Men, are discarded in favor of narratives supporting Russian expansionism. I'll have to leave it at that for now. Something really crazy happened yesterday that if you want to talk about in the Q&A, I will talk about. But that's it for now. Thank you so much. I'm happy to take questions. Please.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. When you talk about establishing like a vague conception of culture for what is Russian, what definition of culture are you using?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And the easiest and least satisfying answer is that the Russian state doesn't have a very good definition. It's pretty opportunistic, the way that they treat almost every kind of aspect of policy. So when it's convenient for culture to mean traditions, when it's convenient for culture to mean linguistic heritage, when it's convenient for culture to mean film production, it's used in a very kind of porous, flexible way. So it's, very context dependent, and I'm sure that that doesn't really answer your question. But they don't have a really particular unified conception of what culture is. There's things that the cultural ministry is responsible for, but that doesn't limit what they actually do in practice. So the Ministry of Culture has, a branch for film production, a branch that, is supposed to oversee museums, but they will also undertake, especially what we see in their social media accounts, all these kind of additional steps, initiatives that kind of, what's the word? That go towards creating this particular informational environment. So, for instance, I really like the example, I think we still see this today with the situation in Kursk, which Ukraine is occupying part of. The idea that we're going to build a narrative that shows that Ukrainians are refugees, they're coming here and we're going to give them this humanitarian help that the textbooks also mentioned, and that Russians are kind of manifesting this patriotic duty and pride in helping the Ukrainians who are quote unquote in need. So that's not, is that culture? Not exactly, but they're doing that anyway. So I'm not sure if that answers your question. Please.
Is there any way that the Kremlin can measure the effectiveness of all of this cultural propaganda? I think most Russians probably hold their nose, and I can't believe that they're putting money into this. It doesn't seem to be an effective way to win over the hearts and minds.
Right, that's a very important question. So a lot of people, some of these movies they put out, and they are panned so, ecstatically by people who think that it's hilarious that the government does precisely this, spends money on these initiatives. And so that's why, so first of all, polling in Russia is like a mixed bag right now, especially. But more broadly speaking, I think that it's, you can't necessarily get from the kind of work that I do anyway, what people think about it so much as you can kind of glean regime attention. So I don't make any, really claims about what people think about it from a quantitative standpoint. But one thing that I think is important that kind of supersedes that is that a lot of this is like signaling that these are the rules of the game. This is the history that is our state history, and it's going to be that way whether you like it or not. So if you want to get a job in academia, if you want to teach, this entire movement is impacting grade school teachers in a really big way right now. Then this is the narrative that you have to follow whether you like it or not. And so even if people don't believe it, and a lot of people obviously don't, it still has this kind of banging you over the head restrictive quality to it that it forces them.
I know this wasn't the topic of your presentation, but is there any linkage that you could point to between the sort of ultra-nationalist, maybe unity-maxing meant for cultural production on the domestic front tied to this rise that you described inside of the culture laws of creating Russia as a reaction against Western ideology, so a disunity campaign in relationship to what we've seen in the United States from the Tenet media that funded a show called Culture War here for the United States, or even the Doppelganger loan indictment, which shows sort of how to create some kind of disunity in an American culture fashion. Are those tied together in the domestic way in Russia?
I think that that's a very apt question because where the Russian state values unity, they aim specifically for disunity in the United States and in targeted countries. So I think that's the most kind of elegant way of putting that, based on your question. That yeah, they recognize the strength of one of those and the danger of the other one. Yeah. So that's part of a much broader, state strategy and a lot more fronts than just cultural politics. But I don't know.
Yeah, I have a question. To what extent do you think this is actually new? Which of this is new? Because a lot of what you're describing seems to me just taken from Soviet history textbooks, Soviet kind of conventions, this emphasis on multinational friendship, this voluntary joining of nations, all that. Just even on a personal level, this is really familiar to me, from reading Soviet textbooks back in the day. It's just very, very much the same note. So I was wondering, have you looked at what they're trying to add to that? Like, or is it just, basically replacing Soviet Union with Russia?
Yeah, I think that what's different is that where the Soviet Union was a national, multi-ethnic empire that kind of tried to preserve that, quality, Russia doesn't really know how to try to do the same thing. They don't know how to talk about it. So that's why Kazakhstan is just Russia. Like why Xinjiang, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and part of Mongolia, in addition to two of ours, they joined Russia. I don't think that they figured out kind of ideologically how to formulate that they want, essentially the same kind of peaceful joining together of nations. So that's where you have this kind of weird linguistic stuff that happens with how they talk about these phenomena. It's one thing to have the Soviet policy of Russification, where you have this kind of big brother model, where the Russians are the big brother and all the other different nations are the little brother. Here, they're more just like trying to say, we're all brothers, and without saying the big brother part out loud about themselves. I just think that they don't have a sophisticated way of explaining that. So I think that it's sloppier is maybe part of the difference between then and now. And I think it's also more, it seems like over the past decade it's become much, there's just much more emphasis on it, and it's much more unified as like a state policy. The Soviet nationalist policy, it changed so much, kind of like what emphasis on what. And this seems very intentional, and I think also it's very contingent on the context of the war in Ukraine that we're seeing all of this right now, proliferation.
Let me just say one thing with regard to that. I'm not a Soviet expert, but one thing I noticed is the emphasis today in Russia on militarization. The Soviet Union was certainly a militarized state, but they downplayed that, talking about peace all the time. Today in Russia, boy, peace is not on the top of the menu. It's not. It's something other than peace.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Can you talk about the relationship between these sort of cultural policies and this warmed over Eurasianism? Are they the same people? Is it being sort of dictated from above, or is it more of a kind of organic affinity? These things are kind of different spots and echo each other?
Yeah, so Eurasianism, Alexander Dugin's philosophy, right? That's really popular among the alt-right in the United States, and among a lot of the right, ultranationalist right in Russia. It's definitely sort of a xenophobic ideology for those of you who aren't familiar. I think precisely because of, there's been stuff written about this that I'm not an expert in, but I think largely because of the way that the alt-right in America has developed, the United States media has kind of latched onto Dugin as more impactful and influential both within Russian society and the Russian government than he actually is or was. So there's been a lot that's been written, kind of, what was it, 2016, 17-ish, kind of speculating that he was kind of whispering in Putin's ear. But most analysis I've seen of kind of among like international relations experts and Russian political scientists is that he's not nearly as influential as the people in the West think that he is for some reason. So yeah, that stuff doesn't really come up as much in the stuff that I've looked at.
Yeah, you talked a little bit about like Putin and Russia's kind of ties to this more like traditional Orthodox identity in Russian church structure. I'm kind of curious if you could elaborate a little bit more how they like balance this Christian kind of right-wing nationalist identity with this like integration of more like fundamentalist like Islamic peoples into the Russian nation state context.
Yeah, that's a great question because for a while, after I noted how technically in law, Russian law and culture after 1991 said explicitly we're not going to have any ideology. We're going to have these official state religions that we recognize, but we're not going to have any ideology. And so you kind of could watch the Russian government in the years after that, especially under Vladimir Putin, kind of try to fill that discursive ideological space with something. And so for a while it was Orthodox Christianity. And that was around the same kind of time that you saw this rise in xenophobic violence xenophobic violence period, associated with Unity Day, but also just associated more broadly with the regime. And so there's a lot of analysis of Russia still now in the West, again, that kind of frames Vladimir Putin as this white nationalist, where he realized, I think, like it was around when he got divorced, but like 2012, 2013, in 2013 in the fall, there were these massive race riots in Moscow, and he kind of pulled back from that, and then kind of gave up on the Orthodox thing. So the church is still very influential, but that's another thing that there just hasn't been kind of enough, I think, ideological sophistication to incorporate in a way that would reach the goals that they want. That kind of reconciles having a special place for Orthodox Christianity that you saw in this family that because I didn't get to talk about this last part that I didn't get to look back into, but this privileging of white Slavic families, this blonde Slavic family, coded as Orthodox, with this desire to incorporate, a huge variety of nationalities into the same state. Yeah, just not doing a very good job.
Thank you, Rebecca, for the great presentation. I will be very grateful if you can comment this text, what I have a plan to read a little bit. Finally, we will find Jews who talk about the urgent need to decolonize of the Russia. We need to divide our overly large country into a couple dozen small and safe states. But they explain who people have a common background and cultural context should be artificially separated. The decolonizers can't explain. This text will be said in September 2024 by Yulia Navalnaya.
I'm sorry, what do you think about it? I think it's easier to probably read that.
I'd just like to ask you, do you think that this is a problem of the national relationship in Russia today? Is there any problem with Putin?
Oh, okay. No. And so there's a great article that I can send it to you by a historian at University of Houston, Alexei Golubov, that he talks about this exact issue and kind of the nuances of the Russian societies, generally even within the opposition that's seen as Western-oriented, they're very much on the right, and they're very much not comfortable with, to a large extent, and I mean like the political right, like on the right-left, spectrum. They're not very comfortable with like the language of decolonization and the idea of Russian empire. I'm speaking very, very generally, but this is kind of the thesis that he forwards in this article, and yeah, so the domestic conversation about within Russia about the importance of, adopting decolonization in a way that's very prominent right now in Western academic discourse, and more broadly in public discourse. Yeah, I mean that is certainly I think that's certainly an ongoing issue. But was there something more specific from her does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you for the question. But in case of the Medinsky, yeah, he's a doctor of history, of course. He have a diploma, but he isn't a historian in my opinion.
Oh no,
It's all like only a sort of the propaganda. It's a part of the propaganda, and he made this way for many years, not only from the time of the Ukrainian war.
Yeah, and for sure, there was a whole kind of movement within Russian academia to take away his diplomas. I'm sure you
Absolutely.
know.
You're right.
And Russian academics they saw it as extraordinarily shameful. There's a lot of discourse about how shameful it was that they weren't able to strip his diploma. So yeah, that's we can talk more about that later. One more question? All right.
Okay, that's just half comment, half question. I'm wondering, when you talk about changing hearts and minds, and as their goals, and people believe in unity as a goal, or as a mind state, or state of the heart, if you will. It's a lot today. Things are a lot different than Peter the Great's day, where a message would have to go by force, I guess. Nowadays, messages go around the world in milliseconds or seconds. What sort of time frame do you see this playing out? I mean, you talked about changes for the primary school teachers. I know you got primary school teachers affected me, but it kind of took some time for that to play out in the world. How they affected me. What sort of time frame do you see as this whole effort? It's going to produce changes within something like a year or 10 years or.
Great question, and just to put it briefly, the other thing I was going to talk about was children and how much focus there is right now on Russian children and also Ukrainian children who've been kidnapped by various components of Russian state organizations. It is a very long-term view. I think that's really important to keep in mind, is that what's been implemented that we're seeing through education, through cultural production, this is like the long game. And so I think that this speaks to the kind of issue of, the question of can Russia and Ukraine, will Russia agree to a peace deal with Ukraine and hold that when this is their kind of long-term cultural, educational framework and direction. I think that should give people some pause who think that the Russian state is going to be interested in, maintaining their side of a peace agreement. Yeah, it is long term.
Okay.
Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca will be also speaking next week online, right? At October 1st at 6.